And if you're going to win souls, you've got to love souls. In spite of their meanness, in spite of the way they look, in spite of everything, you've got to seek to bring souls to Jesus Christ because you love them, because Jesus loved them, and because Jesus died for them, and you're trying to bring them to the Son of God.
Thank you for listening to Sandy Creek Stirrings. I am your host, Joshua Jimenez, and thank you for joining me here on the podcast. Excited about today's episode. I'm going to share a little bit of my story in an episode series entitled My Story Won't Wow You. You say, what do you mean? What do you mean your story won't wow me? Look, I didn't come from a life of drugs. I've never taken a drink of liquor. I've never taken a puff of a cigarette. I've never been to jail. I've never slept on the streets. My story is just kind of this, I was raised in a Christian home type story. It just won't wow you. I don't know about you, but I love listening to the stories of people who, they came from those things. There's something special about it. It's just incredible, the work of God that you can see within that story. Not to say that God hasn't worked in my life. He absolutely has, and I can show you many things. But everybody has a story. Just like fingerprints, it's intrinsic to that individual. And so today I'm going to continue my story from episode number 88, My Story Won't Wow You, the story of my two births. And you say, your two births? What are you talking about? And I go back and listen to that episode. Not only was I born on June 27th of 1996 on Keesler Air Force Base, but I was also born again back on March 3rd of 2000. And God did a wonderful work in my life, and how incredible it was, the work that God did. And March 3rd, 2000, God saved my soul. And, I'm going to heaven not because I was raised in a Christian home, not because I'm a good person, not because I was baptized, not because I've been to church all my life, not because I walked up to the front, I prayed a prayer. I don't really know what happened, but I prayed a prayer. That means I got saved. No, you need to go back. Go back and listen to episode number 88 and hear my testimony of salvation. That's not the portion of this story we're going to talk about today, though. We're going to continue on with a little bit of the rest of the story. And I heard a lot of good feedback from that episode number 88, people who said they wanted me to continue the story. They wanted to hear more. And so as promised, we'll give you a little bit more of that story. My story won't wow you. And so we'll listen to a little bit more of that portion today, or I'll give it to you. I'll talk about it. You can listen. And but let me encourage you to do this. You can always send in feedback, a question, a comment. You can always do that at sandycreekstirrings.com. Simply click the menu button, or if you're on a computer, the menu will be right there, and you can click the contact page. And there you can just fill out that simple contact form, and you can send in a question, a comment, some feedback, whatever you like, and you can send that in there at sandycreekstirrings.com. Let me also encourage you to do this. If you listen on iTunes, you listen on Apple Podcast, let me encourage you you can leave the podcast a review. And what that simply does is, by leaving the podcast a review, it simply helps other listeners to find the podcast. Obviously, the way this works is, the more good reviews you get, the higher you rise, and the more you rise up through the charts, the more people begin to be able to see your podcast. And so by doing that, you're just simply helping other listeners to be able to find the podcast and be able to hear the same content that you've been able to hear for going on 92 episodes now. And so make sure to do that. You can do that on Apple Podcasts. You can also leave us a review on Facebook as well. So my story won't wow you. Last time we left off, my family and I, and I'm not going to do a whole lot of review. You can always go back and listen to that previous episode. But my family and I, we packed up and we left. My dad had finished his Bible Institute, his Bible college days, and so I was just a 5-year-old little boy. And we packed up and we left Carthage, Missouri, where we lived. Beautiful snow. And we left where we lived, and we moved down to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where my dad became on staff at the Central Baptist Church of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, as the bus director. And it was there, just an exciting church. This church at that time, and they had a lot of ministries that were running. They had a large bus ministry. They had a large church staff. They had a Christian school. They had sports programs. They had all the things that a larger church ministry would have. And it was really just an exciting time. There's something exciting about having those different ministries up and running. So at that time, I turned 6 years old and went into first grade. And so I was enrolled in the school there at the Central Baptist Church. I honestly don't even remember the name of the school, and probably Central Baptist something, and enrolled there in the school for first and second grade. And there's something just exciting. I was homeschooled for the rest of my life. After second grade, my mom homeschooled us for the rest of our life. I have to admit, I really enjoyed both. But I'm a great classroom person. There's something about sitting in a desk and having other students around you that just makes me focus a little bit more. And for some kids, it's not that way, and that's perfectly fine. But I excel in a classroom setting with other people around me, and really enjoyed being able to go to the Christian school. And we just had a wonderful time there. I was able to play basketball, and I enjoyed that. And we had a great time there at Central Baptist School. And I'll tell you this: one day some of the kids were doing something. My teacher, a wonderful lady, my teacher was she was having a little bit of a problem. People had been stealing sticky tack from her desk. And, this is first and second grade, and kids were stealing sticky tack from her desk. And I remember this was probably one of the first instances of having a bad influence at being under peer pressure. And I'm sure you've been there before, having been peer pressured to do something. And I remember some of the friends, they wanted me to steal some sticky tack too. And so I remember during, I don't remember when it was exactly, but I remember I snuck up when the teacher was out of the room, and I grabbed some sticky tack, the little blue stuff, and I ran back to my desk, and I kind of just shoved it up under the desk, and just kind of stuck it to the underside of the desk to keep it there, and never stole anything, at least that I remembered. Never stole anything, and the teacher came back in the room, and she realized that somebody had stolen some of her sticky tack, and here I am, good little Christian boy, had just stolen. I was a thief. I was a robber. And I remember she walked through, and for whatever reason, she knew it was me. I have no idea why, but my teacher, she was smart. She knew it was me, and she looked at me, and she said, "Joshua, did you steal some of the sticky tack?" And here I was, this little 6-year-old boy, and I just started bawling. I took the sticky tack, and oh my goodness. And she cried, and she didn't punish me, probably because I was of a tender and meek spirit, and I was brokenhearted. And that was really the first trauma in my life. I really have a deep wound there in my heart from stealing sticky tack, and not really. But I had a wonderful time in the Christian school. We had a great time. Let me encourage you, parents that are listening. Any type of education you can give your children, as far as a Christian education, a Christian school is a phenomenal thing to allow them to go to compared to a public school. And Dr. Dave McCoy, in his interview episode here on the podcast, he talked about the importance of having a Christian education and how a Christian school can really help. Now, does that mean every single kid in that school acts like a Christian and is a Christian at heart? No, absolutely not. I mean, there's some really, really rough kids in a lot of Christian schools, but there's just something about having a Christian-based education. Now, I would encourage you, for me and my kids, what we're going to do is we're going to homeschool them, and I think that almost might be, in some scenarios, it might even be a better option, and just depends, and that's my personal opinion. You could have a different opinion than me, and that's fine. And we're both entitled to our opinions. That's my opinion. I think in a lot of scenarios that homeschooling may even be a little bit better in some scenarios. And so, but let me encourage you, if you are able to, as a parent, to get your kid into some sort of Christian education, it will greatly help them. It really will. It'll get them out from a major influence of the world in public education. It'll get them out from teaching things that really, at the ages that they're exposing things to our kids nowadays that they should have never been exposed to at that age. It'll keep them away from those things, and it's a protection of your children. So let me encourage you to do that. Now, on that note, that does not mean that just because they go to a Christian school, there won't be bad influences. And there are. I remember experiencing that firsthand. If you remember last time, we talked about My Story Won't Wow You in the episode entitled Two Births. I talked about how I had a wonderful, godly Christian influence friend who really helped me to grow. But it was there in the Christian school that I met some friends who weren't the greatest influence, and they weren't necessarily bad people. They weren't like just ungodly, wicked, heathen people, but they were people that were, how can I put it, worldly, carnal, fleshly minded. I remember I would go over to their house and watch movies that I wasn't allowed to watch as a 6-year-old, as a 7-year-old. Watch movies that I wasn't allowed to watch. Talk about things that a 6- and 7-year-old should not talk about. And so I think it's very important. I can still go back and tell you some of the stories and some of the things that were talked about, some of the things that were watched back when I was 6 and 7 years old. Here's what I'm trying to get the point across to as parents, and I have 3, well, I'm about to have the 3rd girl now, and but I'm a parent of 3 children. And so one thing that we're going to have to understand as parents is the importance of protecting your children from the wrong influences that will try to creep into their life. Look, just because you send them to a Christian school doesn't mean you can let them hang out with every single person at that school. Look, here's the deal. One of the hardest decisions you're going to have to make as a parent is recognizing that, you know what, I don't have a problem with that family. It's nothing necessarily wrong with them. But when my teenage son hangs out with their teenage son, they're just not good for each other. So you know what, I don't have a problem with that family. Love their family, but son, you're not allowed to hang out with him anymore. That's a tough decision, but you know what? You need to protect your children because you're understanding, and you need to understand that wrong influences can come in any shape, form, or package. Come in any shape, form, or package, and we have to be very careful. I remember my parents eventually made the decision that I wasn't allowed, unless it was a family member, grandma, grandpa, Grammy, grandpop, if I could only stay the night at their house. If it was a friend, I couldn't stay the night at their house because they began to recognize the dangers of not being in an environment to where you can actually see the influence that your children are under. And so I don't know if that's the decision you need to make for your home or not. That's something for you. But you need to be very careful because your children, if you're not keeping an eye on the influences that are in their life, listen, I cannot stress the importance of this enough. If you're not watching the influences that are in their life, don't be shocked when they have knowledge about things that they should have never had knowledge about because of an influence that introduced them to those things. So I think that's very important, whether it be on a Christian school level, whether it be on a youth group level, whether it be, hey, they're going to public school, you need to be very careful with who you're letting them spend time with. Be very careful. A ungodly influence can really wreak havoc upon the life of our young people. So it was there in Hattiesburg that I learned that lesson that I can go back and look at now. And but we truly had a wonderful time there in Hattiesburg. Dad was very busy, a lot going on in the ministry there, and Dad took time just to do his job right. Something Dad taught me as a kid going up all the way through was, to do the job, but to do it right. You can do a job, but you can do it wrong. You can do it half-hearted. Something my dad taught me and instilled in me from a very young age is to do the job right. And so Dad did that. We had a wonderful time there in Hattiesburg. Can look back with many fond memories. I can think of a few different things. We had a dog by the name of Shadow, a golden retriever. Of course, Shadow would be from the old VHS tape series Homeward Bound. And, of course, there was a golden retriever, Shadow. And so we had Shadow. And, the crazy thing is when we decided we needed to move away from Hattiesburg, we moved and we joined the staff at the Winkler Road Baptist Church in Fort Myers, Florida, which would come 2 years later. Shadow ran away the night before we left. And so somewhere out there, I'm sure he's gone by now, but Shadow did whatever he did. And so Shadow left us the night before we moved to Fort Myers, and I'm very sad. We never did find him. And so had to say goodbye to Shadow. But anyway, we had a wonderful time there in Hattiesburg. I remember just enjoying sports. Something that I remember about sports is something that I warn parents about today. You have to be very careful with sports in the life of your young person. And you heard me say it on the podcast before. Sometimes young people can get so focused on sports that they forget about the things of God. They forget about the things of God. They'll start going to football practice instead of church on Wednesday night. They'll start skipping out on church activities because they have a baseball game. They'll start skipping out on Sundays because they've got a soccer tournament. You have to be very careful with your kids in sports, but not only that, you have to be very careful if you have dress standards. All right, if you have standards of, this is how we dress because we're going to be modest, be very careful that you don't let sports violate those dress standards. Be very careful that you don't let sports violate those dress standards. And because sports has a way of, somebody told me yesterday, they said, rules weren't meant to be broken, they were meant to be bent. And if I had looked at my father and told him that when I did something, Dad, rules weren't meant to be broken, but they were meant to be bent, he would have bent something over my rear end. And, in the same sense, we can't allow sports and social functions to bend our rules and our standards that God has put into our life. Stick by your standards. Stick by your rules. And so there we grew up 6 and 7, went through almost 8, and went and lived in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Had, as I said, wonderful times there. Can look back at fond memories of our time there. But then God called us away and moved us to the Winkler Road Baptist Church in Fort Myers, Florida. That was difficult. I remember my parents told us, we're moving. Don't tell anybody. It's not official yet. We need to announce it to the church. And, my dad was on staff, so it needed to be announced in the right way. And so they had told us, I'm 6 and 7, or I was 7 at the time. And so Dad said, don't tell anybody. And I remember it was one of my last days of school, the school year, and our teacher stood up. And she said, let's talk about what you're going to be doing this summer. And so this kid went over here, what he was going to do this summer, and this kid over here, what he was going to do this summer. And it came to little Josh, and I stood up, and I said, we're moving this summer. And violated everything my dad told me not to do, and let the word out and spilled the beans. And but anyway, we moved to the Winkler Road Baptist Church of Fort Myers, Florida. We bought a house out in Lehigh Acres, and God just began to do a wonderful work there at the Winkler Road Baptist Church. We got into homeschooling. And that was an adventure. Mom was the teacher. We didn't do videos or anything like that. Like, Mom was literally the teacher. God bless her. And thank you, Mom. I know you're probably listening. Thank you. And you're just great, because I would have never done that. That would be very difficult. She was homeschooling 3 kids, the teacher of all 3 of them, one of them learning how to read. I don't know if you've ever sat down with a kid who's learning how to read. It is one of the longest things. Jane, but it's not just Jane, it's Jane. Jane sees Spot run. And it's like, wow, great job, Jane. And but anyway, it could be this long thing. So, Mom, you're a hero. And, teaching 3 kids. And my wife will have to do that one day, and that'll be fun for her. And so, but she began to homeschool us. We loved homeschooling. We got involved in the ministries there at the Winkler Road Baptist Church, and God was just doing great things. Shortly after we moved, had my 8th birthday. And God just began to, work in ways that were just phenomenal. God worked things out with us buying a house. God worked things out with us moving. God worked things out with just in the church. And Dad was the youth director there at the Winkler Road Baptist Church. And things were going great. And then one day, in July of 2006, we knew that something was in the air. As an 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid, you could tell something was in the air family-wise. And decisions were being made. You weren't really sure what, but decisions were being made. And you could just tell something was in the air. And I remember Dad called us downstairs. We lived in a 2-story stilt home. And Dad called us downstairs. And he said, I remember he sat us on the couch down in the Eagles room. And my dad has always been a big Philadelphia Eagles football fan. And at that house, it was a larger house, I think the biggest house we've ever lived in, and 2-story. And down beside the main bedroom, there was a smaller living room area down there, but there was an Eagles room. And it was colored with midnight green and white and gray. And I remember we sat down in the Eagles room, and Dad told us we'd be moving. And we'd only been there for 2 years, and we would be moving because God had called us to be missionaries. And we knew that Dad had been praying about this and been talking about this. And Dad said, we're going to be missionaries. God has called our family. And so he began to explain what would be happening. We would be leaving the Winkler Road Baptist Church. We would load up in a motorhome. Now, missionaries do it a lot of different ways. Some missionaries get in a van and they go to hotels and they live out of a suitcase. And Dad wanted to buy a motorhome. And he said we'd be traveling around in a motorhome, we'd be towing a car behind it, and we would still be homeschooling, but we'd be traveling around to churches to raise money for support, and then we would go down to St. Bartholomew in the French West Indies where God had called us. And it was a decision that my dad had been just praying about for a long time. You see, my grandmother was born on the island of St. Bartholomew, a little island owned by France, just beside St. Martin. And my grandmother was born and raised on that island. That's where still, at that time, my great-grandmother lived, and many of my family members on that side, on my Grammy's side, they lived in St. Bart's. And for years and years and years, there was no gospel witness on St. Bart's. As far as we can go back in history, there was no gospel witness on St. Bart's. The true gospel had never been preached on that island. And for years and years and years, Dad had prayed, Lord, please send somebody to be a missionary to St. Bart's. Lord, please send somebody to be a missionary to St. Bart's. Lord, please send somebody to be a missionary to St. Bart's. And a couple of years later, it changed. Lord, send somebody or send me. Lord, send somebody or send me. You know, that's an entirely different prayer to pray. It's easy to pray, Lord, I pray that you'd have, let somebody do this. Lord, have somebody, Lord, would you please provide somebody to work for the bus ministry at our church? Lord, would you please provide somebody to work the nursery at our church? Lord, would you please provide? But it's a whole different thing to say, Lord, would you please provide somebody or use me if it's your will? That's a whole different story. It goes along the lines of, when Isaiah said, here am I, Lord, send me, making yourself available to God. We really don't have enough people making themselves available for whatever God wants them to do. We don't have enough people in our churches who are making themselves available for whatever the pastor needs them to do. There are ministries to be run, and we just don't have the people who are willing. We don't have the people who are willing. And so I remember my dad prayed that prayer, Lord, send somebody or send me. And God finally, after a few years, said, I'll send you. And so I remember Dad made that announcement to us, and we began the busy job of packing and putting the house for sale. We had a big old yard sale and sold things and just began to minimalize everything and get the house for sale. And we began prepping to move. And God just really led our family down that track, gave us a peace about leaving. Was it difficult? For sure. For sure. It's always difficult to leave. I remember the night that we announced it, we had a family function because we lived in Fort Myers. That's where my dad's parents lived, my mom's parents lived, and so we all met together at my grandparents' house, and I think we had the prayer cards printed, and missionaries give out a prayer card. It typically has the family on there, and it's got their name, where they're going, and their vision and what their plan is, and pray for us. And so I remember we had those prayer cards printed, and that was in an envelope, and I remember Dad handed one to Grandma. And my Grandma Sherry Willoughby, is one of the sweetest ladies you will ever meet. And I don't know if she's listening or not, but Grandma, thank you. You're a sweet lady, and you can thank me later and pay me later for that. And but anyway, Grandma's just a sweet lady. But Grandma, she will shed tears at really anything, and it's very precious because she, you know how Grandma's feeling. And that's very nice to know. And Grandma, I remember she opened it up and she began weeping because her daughter, her son-in-law, their 3 grandchildren were leaving. I mean, here was the plan. We were coming to live back in Fort Myers, Florida. We were one big happy family. Everybody was going to be together. And now her daughter, one of her daughters, and 3 of her grandchildren were leaving and going overseas. When would we see them? How would that work? And that was difficult. Sometimes I think we go into churches and we think about our missionaries. We hear their prayer letters read. We see a missionary who's got a card, and all we think is, wow, they're leaving. Let's pray for them. But we fail to see sometimes the struggles that they actually go to. The family members who have wept because they're unsure of the next time they're going to be able to see their grandchildren couple years down the road maybe. We see all these different things, and we fail, though, to recognize some of the struggles behind what they went through to make themselves available to God. It cost them something. Listen, it's not just this free pass, it cost them something. And I remember that night, many tears were shed, and it became official. We were leaving. Dad had announced it to, of course, Pastor Strange, who was there at that time, a wonderful man of God. And shortly thereafter, it was announced to the church that we were leaving. We packed up the house and put everything in boxes. I remember Dad went out and bought a motorhome, a 40-foot, it was a Jayco, I believe, and I could be wrong, but it was a 40-foot Jayco. We got a little tow dolly and put our silver Buick LeSabre on there, and we were ready to go. Things were exciting. We parked the motorhome up behind the church. The house was supposed to go for sale, and it was selling. We got a contract on it. Things were good to go. We were going to have some money in the bank, to be able to pay for gas and to be able to pay for all these things. We already had some meetings set up. We were, going to be going up to New York very shortly, and then over to Mississippi, and things were just going well, and we were excited. We were pumped up. And I think it was the day before we were supposed to leave, you know what happened? The house fell through. The financing for the people who were going to buy the house fell through. We had $1,000 in the bank. And you might have heard my dad, if you've listened to him preach at any point in time, you might have heard him tell the story of that story, how the financing for the house fell through. And we had $1,000 in the bank. Well, if I can back up just a little bit, my dad had a young lady in the youth group. My mom and dad had this young lady, and they were praying with her, and she was praying about going to a college in California. And they told her, if you decide to go there, we talked to the staff there at that college, and they said if you have $1,000, they could help you with the rest, and they could help you find a job and everything. And they said, so if you decide to go, we'll give you your first $1,000. Well, it was there at church. And we were just having our final, going away service, people crying, people weeping. It was sad. It was heartbreaking. That was a very emotional night. We got back in the camper, and I remember that young lady knocked on the door, and she said she was crying, and she said, I decided that God wants me to go out to that college in California. And Dad wrote the check. We only had $1,000. Now we had no dollars. We didn't have enough gas to leave the church parking lot. And, we did, obviously, in the tank, but we didn't have enough gas to get out of Florida. We didn't have the gas to get very far away from Fort Myers. The financing for the house fell through. And you say, why would God do that? Why would God allow all that to fall through? You guys were trusting Him. You guys had made yourself available. Why would God allow that to happen? Here's why. Because He wanted us to live by faith. Oh, it's super easy to leave and to do all those things knowing, well, we've got a whole house, for sale back here. We've got all that money in a fund, and, we're fine. We can make it. We can do this. Here's what God wanted us to realize. No, you can't do this. You need me. You need to trust me. And God was teaching our family a vital lesson right there. Before we even got on the missionary trail, He was teaching us a vital lesson throughout this journey. You're going to have to trust me. There will be times things will break down, things will fall apart, things will be broken, and you're going to have no way of fixing it. So you're just going to have to trust me. And God provided. I remember that night we had that service. The $1,000 was given away. We had no money. And a missionary came up to my father and handed him an envelope. Said, here, I wanted to give this to you just to be a blessing. And turned and walked away. We got to the motorhome. Eyes red. We just wept many tears. And it had been an emotional night. Said goodbye to the people at church. We weren't sure the next time we were going to see them. And, friends and family. It was just an emotional evening. We were pulling out of the church parking lot the next morning and saying goodbye to home. And I remember we got into the camper. Things were kind of quiet. And Dad reached into his suit coat and pulled out that envelope. And inside that envelope was $1,000. And just like that, God said, I can take care of you. I will take care of you. That's a lesson he would teach us many more times over the missionary trail and traveling from church to church every single week. And maybe next time, if you desire to hear more of the story, maybe I can share some of those stories of the miracles, miracles that God did while we traveled across America. And that 40-foot old, tattered and battered, and maybe I'll tell you how tattered and battered the Jayco was, and that tattered and battered 40-foot Jayco motorhome with a Buick LeSabre towing behind. God did some incredible things, some miracles, true miracles. If you'd like to hear that rest of that story, and to have the story continued, why don't you email me at joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com. Again, that's joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com, or go to the contact page on our website, sandycreekstirrings.com, and simply send a message. Say, hey, I want to hear the rest of the story. Let me ask you this. What's your story? What has God done in your life? What's your testimony? Have you told somebody about it? Have you told somebody today how good God has been to you? If you haven't, then make sure to do that today. And as you do, my friend, keep looking up and keep stirred up for the cause of Christ.